Thank you very much to Dominique, the entire Danyliw seminar crew, and all of you for braving the post-lunch discussion. I can't believe that this is my first time here at Danyliw, and it's quite the do you put on, so it's really lovely, and I hope I can come back in the future. This is a paper out of a project with Henry Hale and Tim Colton. We have several papers on the go, and yes, but this paper is actually the empirical motivation behind our study. So we back in 2014, when we were applying to do a panel survey, we thought that the case of Ukraine would be this really important case for people who study electoral behavior and public opinion in times of conflict. And we designed our questions in mind with this. So we were lucky enough to get the support of the National Science Foundation in the US and the Ukrainian Studies Fund, actually, for the third wave, to conduct a really important, I think, panel survey. And Eric was also along for the ride there. We were able to design a panel survey that followed the same group of people as the conflict was unfolding, capturing both of the presidential and parliamentary elections. And there's 70-something questions in every single way. There's a lot of amazing data here, and we're just starting to scrape at the top of what we have. But the theoretical motivation behind this paper particularly is that in political science behavioral literature, we have these expectations that conflicts will produce a mobilizational rally effect. So we should expect people to move to the incumbent during elections. There's also a slightly, I think, at times even contradictory claim in the literature that there should also be a demobilization effect during elections conducted during times of war, where you see this exit behavior. People who intended to vote in the early stages or before the conflict escalated, and then do not actually turn out to vote or exit the political arena, as we say. But the thing is that very few studies have been able to isolate the effects of war over 2 election cycles, and we still know very little about who becomes a rallier, who becomes an exiter, and what drives this political behavior change. So we do ask exactly this in our paper: what drives rallying around the incumbent, or what drives exiting from the electoral arena altogether during times of conflict? Now, the wartime elections in Ukraine are, it's really, I think, really impressive. The presidential election, it was a decisive win. It's historic for many reasons, and we could have a whole discussion separate to that. But 55% of the vote in the first round, which hasn't happened since the first presidential elections in Ukraine, was really important. We clearly saw a rallying around the presidential candidate, Petro Poroshenko, an oligarch. We also wrote a paper about that. But then, all the political scientists, area studies experts that knew Ukraine very well, we were all expecting identity, ethno-linguistic identity specifically, to harden as the conflict escalated, and we expected there to be greater ethno-linguistic polarization and actually a turn to radical right-wing parties. Come October, we don't actually see that. And I think for political scientists, that was, again, a surprise. What we did see is there was a significant rallying around moderate political blocs, I think a shunning of radical right-wing parties, and we have to stress this. There was a peaceful election of a new parliament as the conflict was getting extremely hot at the time. I think it's very, thinking back to that period in the conflict, this was a very hot period. And what you do see is 65% of the vote went to the pro-Euromaidan parties, as we can say, and 44% went either to the president's party or the prime minister's party. This is a significant rallying effect. Of course, there was low voter turnout. The literature would have expected low voter turnout with elections so closely together, but this was a 7% drop from the last parliamentary elections in 2012, and it was significantly lower in the eastern oblasts, specifically near to or in occupied territories of the Donbass. Okay, but we do see what the literature would expect to see in times of conflict. We do see a significant rally effect in our data, and we do see some exit effect. So in in the first wave of our survey, 18% said, this is in May, okay, 2014, 18% said that they plan to vote for Petro Poroshenko's party. And then in wave 3, which is in November, after the parliamentary elections, 35% report having voted for the Petro Poroshenko bloc in the parliamentary elections. So we count this as our ralliers. This is the people, the 17% that moved to the incumbent. And then we also see this exit effect, where in the first wave, 72% of our respondents said that they planned to vote in the parliamentary elections should there be parliamentary elections. And by the third wave, only 64% reported having done so. And that's an 8% exit from the electoral arena. Now, how did people try to, I mean, I don't think there's a full study of this, but people were explaining some of the tendencies. Ukraine specialist scholars, again, focus on ethno-linguistic identities as potential explanations, and region and proximity to the conflict as driving wartime vote preferences. Political science behavior, if we turn to this, there's a variety of other propositions. I can't go into these in great detail at this time, but there is an idea that people who are members of parties are going to be less likely to both exit, depending on which party they are a member of, and turn to the incumbent. Clientelistic networks, both related to oligarchic structures and to parties, also may have a mobilizational or demobilizational effect. General appraisal of the incumbents dealing with the war, this kind of, so it's not just the war context itself, but believing that the incumbent is doing a good job or the right things in dealing with the war. General policy alignment with the incumbent's party, and media consumption. Now, of course, this is an incredibly rich and complicated literature, and this is like opening up the box that you really don't want to open up, and you always find interesting things, but you know, there's all sorts of problematic elements to studying media consumption, reported media consumption especially, but there's this idea that depending on the media that you are exposed to, this could shape your views of the incumbent, and therefore it would also drive whether or not you would rally around the incumbent's party or exit. But the logic is still very much that these factors would be exacerbated by the conflict, and it's very conflict specific. So I have to say, for the past 4.5 years now almost of dealing with this data, I've been pushing this idea in our group like a little mouse that could. I'm not fully convinced by some of the existing explanations of public opinion and electoral behavior in Ukraine, and I really never have been, but oftentimes I didn't have the tools and the data to be able to test some of my propositions, other people's propositions. And there's a large literature on the economic factors of voting behavior. This is certainly not new, but I'm sometimes puzzled why it isn't always included or explored in different analyses. And I mean, there are many more studies than just these two, but Gwen and Alice and Elise, they both found that socioeconomic well-being, or their lack of, combined with a feeling of being left behind or not listened to by the government or the state, is what is driving support for separatism in the east of the country and among IDPs and those residing in occupied territories. So in line with this thinking, we also propose that rather than variables connected to the conflict itself or ethno-linguistic identity variables, that it could be something about economic security and or believing that one is being left behind or not being listened to, that could be driving both this rallying or exit effect. Now, there's no way I can go into all the details of the paper, but we do conduct a stepped logistic regression, and we're reporting the full effects where all of our variables were scaled from 0 to 1. This is like everyone in our data set goes from the youngest age in our data set to the oldest age in our data set in our analysis. And in this, we follow the causal sequencing proposals in Campbell et al. And Colton, where we believe that certain things come at a causal stage prior to others, and therefore they need to be reported and accounted for in that way. So what we include in the dependent variables are whether or not somebody rallied, moved to the incumbent. So all those who moved to the incumbent are a 1. all the others are 0. It's a binary variable. And all the exiters, all those who said they would vote but did not report having voted, are a 1, and all others are 0. And so in the first stage of our analysis, we looked at what we say are observed demographic factors, which we have a variable for distance to the conflict. We know it's problematic. We have issues with it. We're trying to think of various ways to develop on this. It's the average distance to Luhansk and Donetsk cities. If you think of the time we are looking at our survey, the actual conflict, the demarcation line isn't quite there in the same way that we now think of it. It's pockets of conflict all over the place. We're trying to think of the best ways to do this. This is what we have for now. We have residents in urban localities, language of the questionnaire, the physical questionnaire that was used, the level of education, gender, and age. In the second wave, we incorporate what we call declared demographic factors, language, and this is, if you kind of had to read a paper by me and Henry earlier, the language embeddedness, language at work, ethno-linguistic identity, which is mother tongue, and national identity, which is forced choice nationality. And then we look at economic variables, family financial situation, which is a 7-point scale of what families can afford, economic, and being an economic winner of transition. For policy alignment, we stuck to people who support joining NATO and people who supported the government's atoll policy. We had a variety of other policy variables in there, and we ran the tests with both preferences for state language, preferences for joining the EU, preferences for closer ties with Russia, preferences for... We tried to really play around with everything that we could think of that would be policy alignment, and we get the same results. And not only because protest participation is my bread and butter, but because I think there is a good theoretical reason for why people who participated in protests may or may not be, at least it could be assumed from the protest literature, that they would be more invested in the elections that come thereafter. So we included whether or not somebody participated in the Euromaidan and whether or not somebody participated in the anti-Maidan and pro-Russian rallies. And we include variables for partisanship, people who are members of parties, and news media consumption, which was people who watched Russian television, people who watched television in the Russian language, and then people who used Odnoklassniki, Kontakte, and Facebook. Okay, and again, we have many other options. We have quite a nice toolkit for media consumption in our survey, and we did test this with other things, including Petro Poroshenko's own channel. And Pershi Nationalny and others. Those were all wave 1 variables. So they were all collected in the first wave, and that helps us with some endogeneity issues, etc. But we did think there were important controls that we didn't have in our first wave, that we had in our second wave and third wave, that we still wanted to include in our models, and that is oligarchic and party clientelistic networks, whether or not you, your friends, your family work for an oligarch's industries. In this case, it was Akhmetov and Poroshenko, and party clientelistic networks, whether you, your friends, your family were members of certain parties. And we did think maybe there could be this rallying effect because you said that you voted for Petro Poroshenko in the presidential elections, although there's issues with that. And then controlling for respondents' own reported reasons of not voting, which we obviously only had in wave 3, but nonetheless, I thought it would be important to unpack. The takeaway here is distance to conflict as we measure it, although it is in some ways, well, it is correlated to region. It is not perfectly correlated to region. But yeah, it is significant. It increases the likelihood of one becoming a rallier or moving to the incumbent by about 12%. But when you control for regions, and we did this in a variety of ways in our model, the effect goes away. So this is why we think we need to have actually also a better measure to be sure that what we're finding is correct. If you're older, you were more likely to rally to the incumbent by 12%. If you're a transition winner, the picture here is mixed, but you are about 5% less likely to rally to the incumbent. And if you are wealthier, you are more likely to, or your family situation is better, you are more likely to rally to the incumbent. And odnoklasniki users, we're exploring what this means in our sample specifically because there could be some questions around that, but you are 6% less likely to move to Poroshenko's party if you declared wanting to vote for other parties in wave one. And in terms of, oh, sorry, I didn't skip through. That's the picture there. I just put in the significant results. Everything else was insignificant. And then for what drives exit, it shouldn't be surprising to those who know electoral behavior, I think. If you were older, you were less likely to exit the electoral arena. And we know that there is an issue with youth voting anyway. Education, if you were better educated, you were less likely to exit the electoral arena. If you were a transition winner, you were more likely to exit the electoral arena, although it's not significant when we first put it into the model. Again, on the joining NATO, on all the other policy preferences, it's pretty much the same picture, and we don't really know what to make sense of it right now, but we don't really particularly see a convincing story there. If you were a Euromaidan participant, you were less likely, again, to exit the voting, the electoral arena. And then when we do control for having voted for Poroshenko in wave 2, you're less likely to exit. And then this is where I found most interesting, and there's all sorts of problems with modeling it this way and putting in this in our model, but I just think it is fascinating that when people reported what were the reasons for them not voting, the fact that their polling station was closed, that their region was no longer in Ukraine, which we still had those people in our sample, and a little bit, few of them, that wasn't significant, and we tried the other explanations as well. But your party not being on the ballot increased the likelihood of you becoming a non-voter by 24%. Yes, I know where you're going. I still think there's something to this, and it needs to be explored. And I just think, so the reason why I say this is because there is about 20 to 30% of the current electorate that doesn't have a political proposition that is actually arguing that it has any chance of winning in the presidential elections or winning a significant representation in parliament based on that. And these people also tend to be living in areas closer to the conflict, but they also tend to be less wealthy. They tend to be actually quite in precarious situations, and they keep reporting in qualitative data that they are feeling like they are left behind. And if this is a trend that we started seeing in 2014 and then it's continued, this is significant, and I don't think people are dealing with it enough. That's a little normative policy kind of last words. I think it's important. Maybe not. Oh, and it's a first cut. Like, this is the roughest thing that we ever could do. This is the first cut of this. So any suggestions you have, we are so excited to hear them. Thank you.